growth number, uh, people react to it in different ways. After all, 5% doesn't sound very low. The US economy is likely to grow at maybe 1% this year, and Europe may actually even have a recession. But 5% is low because the base last year was so low. China only grew at 3% last year. So 5% against 3% is actually a relatively conservative estimate. To give you some measurement of or estimate of how conservative it is, go back to 2020, the first year of COVID. China grew at 2%. 2% was actually good back then. It was the only major economy that had positive growth. But then you go to the next year, 2021, and again, you had a low base year of 2%. Growth in China was 8% that year. So this 5% should be judged against the 8% rebound in 2021. And by that measure, it's very low. Now, why is it very low? Either growth has to be driven by trade, infrastructure investment, or consumption. And the property market has been in doldrums for the last 2 years because of financial pressures. Construction basically ceased, purchases stopped. Consumption stopped because of the zero COVID policies. The only thing that was driving or keeping the economy going last year was basically trade, exports to the United States and Europe. So let's look at this year. This year, with recession or lower growth in the West, trade will not be a driver of growth in China, so you can't count on that anymore. The property market is starting to rebound, but it has fundamental problems. Construction companies don't have the funds. People are worried about whether they want to invest in housing. Can you then count on what I call local governments to build infrastructure, roads, highways, power plants? The answer is not, because they're experiencing severe financial pressures. So you're not going to get a so-called major property rebound. You're not going to find local governments propping up infrastructure investments. And on the external side, it looks very, very pessimistic. And that's why 5% growth is seen as a conservative estimate. But even 5% may actually turn out to be a little bit too high. My own guess is it may even come in lower. And the reason is that people are expecting Chinese households to spend a lot more now that the COVID policies have been relaxed. And they build this upon numbers which show that bank deposits in the last year or two soared. So the issue is that there's repressed consumption. But this is actually quite misleading. The increase in household deposits over the last year or two doesn't actually come from what I call middle-class households. It comes from the relatively wealthy segments of society who actually move their money out of property and equity markets into the bank accounts. And they're not moving it back to the intention to actually consume more. They're basically risk averse. They're worried about the future. So we may not get as big a consumption rebound as one might hope for. So I think actually 5% is not actually a conservative estimate. It may actually be a relatively too optimistic estimate, and we have to be worried about this. The COVID issue to the side, China's moved from what I call zero COVID to no COVID policies, just basically let it totally go. So let's assume it's under control. And the evidence thus far is that it's abating in China, as it is elsewhere in the world. So hopefully we cross our fingers that COVID won't be an issue in the future. The question then is really the long-term growth rate. Let's get beyond this year. What's going to happen the next year? And then let's say the next 3 or 4 or 5 years. That's what really matters. And here you have very divergent views about growth prospects in China. There's some who predict that China's growth may not stay at 4 or 5%, but it may actually collapse to 1 or 2 or 3%. And why are they saying this? Well, they're saying that the major driver of China's growth over the past 10 years, 15 years, has essentially been urbanization. If you go back 30 years ago, China's urban population was only 20%. It increased sharply to about 65% today. And that 65% means that 200, 300 million households moved to cities, created demands for housing, generated the major infrastructure investments. But urbanization is moderated. It's slowed down. So you cannot count on urbanization. You can't count on what I call the increased productivity of rural farmers moving to the cities and finding jobs in industries and services. That was the major driver of China's growth. You cannot expect China to be exporting a lot to the West growth in the West is going to be actually quite moderate. There's also a trade war going on, lots of tariffs and restrictions on China's exports. So there is a problem here. You cannot count on the urbanization to drive growth. You can't count on property construction. You can't count on trade. And people are therefore asking consumption. Chinese households need to consume more. But this particular line of reasoning is actually, in terms of economics, not valid. There is no such thing as a consumption-driven growth, okay? Growth comes from investment and increases in productivity. And if you grow faster and people's incomes are higher, then they consume more. But they don't just consume more because you tell them to consume more. They only consume more if they feel like their wages are going higher and they feel like more secure, or they feel like the economy is doing well. And that's not the situation. So economically speaking, if growth is to basically increase in the future, China has to find ways to keep investment going. And for that to happen, you have to find ways to increase productivity. And this is where we have a major problem. Productivity of investment in China has been declining steadily for more than a decade. If you go back 10 or 15 years, when the country invested, it generated returns which were above normal for emerging market economy. That's why China is able to grow 10% or even 8% a year. But today, China's investment productivity is basically fallen to the same levels as other countries. And it's not getting the same return. That's why there's financial problems. If you borrow and you invest and you're generating not as much output, then you're going to have financial difficulties. So that's a major problem. So here's the China today. Productivity is declining steadily. Financial problems are significant. The government cannot continue stimulating the economy. So the real issue for China is, can they find ways to increase the productivity investment and continue to grow at what I would call a moderate rate for the next 5 years, the rest of this decade, of let's say 4 to 5%. That will be a challenge. Now, this is a very interesting issue here, because the question then becomes, does China have potential to grow rapidly without what I call stimulating the economy? And here's what I would call a paradox. China is still a very distorted economy, but because it's a distorted economy, it means that if it changes its policies, if it reforms, it can continue to grow very, very rapidly. And that's very, very different from other countries. Take Japan, for example. Japan's economy has been growing at 1% for decades. They've been trying to get it to grow faster. But the reality is there's no possibility for Japan to grow much more rapidly. It's a relatively efficient economy. There isn't much you can do. But China is quite different. There are, in fact, a lot of things that China could do. Well, if you go back to last 10 or 15 years, as I mentioned, growth was essentially being spurred or promoted by urbanization. More people from rural areas coming into the cities. They spend, there's demand for housing. You're building more infrastructure. China grows very, very rapidly. And these workers coming into the city become more productive. They're producing export materials. They're going into services. China grows very, very rapidly. That will not continue. So your problem now is, how do I get more productivity or more consumption out of households who are already in the major cities? And here's the interesting point in China. About 40 to 50% of the households in the major cities in China are what we would call migrant workers. And they're migrant workers because they don't have legal residency rights. What does that mean? Essentially, they're treated as if they're non-citizens. They can't buy housing. They can't send their kids to local schools. They can't apply for certain jobs. Some even leave their families back home in the rural areas. Now, what is the economic implication? There's obviously a social implication, the question of whether these people are being treated equally or justly, but there's an economic implication. The economic implication is that migrant worker households consume about 40% less than normal Chinese households. And they basically have to save more, and essentially force savings. It's part of the reasons why China as a whole saves a lot, why there's so much money in the banks. There's no way for them to actually spend the money. So suppose China said to these households, I will treat you like normal Chinese. You have complete residency rights where you live. Consumption would increase dramatically. This would add maybe 1 to 1.5 percentage points a year to China's growth rate. And it doesn't cost anything. It doesn't force the government to spend any more money. They don't have to spend any kind of social programs. They don't have to basically lend any more money. It basically be making use of the savings which already exist. So there's a tremendous distortion. But there's also a side benefit from this. China, migrant workers, they can't move easily. And if they do move and they want to get residency rights, they can only move to small and medium-sized cities. So you have a very strange situation. You have major cities in China, 20 million, more than 20 million population, but they're actually too small. They're too small because migrant workers are no longer allowed to move to the big cities. They can only move to small cities. So again, why is this an economic issue? It's an economic issue because the productivity of workers is about 30%, 40% greater in the so-called big cities comparison with the medium and small cities. So if you actually allow these migrant workers to actually move, they would actually move to Shanghai more, Beijing or Shenzhen or Guangzhou. This would increase China's growth rate by another 1% a year. The fact that you have more productivity coming from your workers. So you have a consumption effect adds 1%, productivity effect adds 1%. You could get 2% growth without any effort in some sense. You don't have to build institutions, you don't have to train more people. You just essentially allow people to live where they want to live. But there are other issues like this too. For a decade or more, the concept of equity in China, what people read in newspapers about common prosperity, that you want incomes to rise equally across the regions, means that China invests a lot, actually 2/3 of its public investment in the interior provinces. If you go back 20 years, it was the reverse. 2/3 were along the coast, 1/3 was in the interior. Now it's the reverse. 2/3 in the interior, 1/3 along the coast. Again, why is this an economic issue? Well, the investment in the interior is 40% lower in returns than investment along the coast. Okay. Now, that investment in the interior is done for both equity reasons as well as strategic reasons. So think about Xinjiang, think about Tibet, think about Inner Mongolia. So you have roads, power systems, communication centers in the interior with very little economic return, but very strong security motivation. But suppose you equalize the investment, no longer 2/3 and 1/3, but just half and half. This would raise China's growth rate by another 1%. And then there's issues about state enterprises. State enterprises have very low rates of return. They're 1/3 the rates of return of private enterprises today. But if you go back 10 or 15 years ago, the profitability, rates of return of state companies were exactly the same as private companies. So it was not always the case that they were lower. So something's happened over the last 10 or 15 years in terms of the way the money is being spent and how state companies are being managed compared to 10 or 15 years ago. Now, let's not be thinking about utopia. Let's not try to say that these state enterprises should have returns equal to private enterprises. Let's just close the gap by a half. So they're still much lower, but no longer as great as it has been in the last 4 or 5 years. This would add another 1 percentage point to GDP growth without any increase in investment or credit flows in aggregate. So in sum, Courtney, China could grow by 3 to 4 percentage points more rapidly than it has been growing with what I call allowing market forces to work. And this would not increase the financial burden or the credit demands on the government. No other country has this kind of potential. And it's strange because this potential comes from the fact that the economy is very distorted. And if you actually sort of like address these distortions, you get a big increase in productivity.
Well,
politically sensitive issues, and let me put it in a way that we might be able to relate to in the United States. We have a similar issue in the United States in terms of illegal immigrants who come into the United States. The question there for Americans is, should we accept them? And if we accept them, do we give them access to medical services, to education? And of course, there's a huge debate here. and we have a big problem in terms of controlling the flow of migrant workers or illegal migrant workers in the U.S. But let's look at China. These so-called migrant workers in China, who, as I said earlier, are about 40% to 50% of the labor force in major cities. They are not foreigners, they are Chinese. So they're not like exactly comparable, but they're treated as if they're foreigners in the sense that they don't have rights, okay? So why is this? And the answer is that China's always had this concept, socialist, communist China, always had this concept that the population should be equally distributed. You don't want concentration of people in any particular city or area. And that's sort of like, goes back to the concept of common prosperity. So you want to actually have smaller, medium-sized cities, more cities, but not such big cities. So the government's policy, grounded in longstanding socialist tradition, is spread the people around. The trouble with that is economics tells us that people want to concentrate. Why do people go to New York? Or why do people go to Silicon Valley? Because of opportunities, ability to generate ideas. That's where the money flows. That's true in Tokyo, and Bangkok, or Singapore, or Hong Kong. Concentration generates higher productivity. So socialist policy, however, has always talked about spreading things around. So this is a big issue. Now, the problem with the government, it always argues and says, well, look, if I allow people or give them residency rights, this will be bad because it will just encourage them to come to the bigger cities. But the point I would make is they're already there. They've already been there for decades. You can also talk about giving residency rights to the existing people in these cities and then somehow regulating the additional flow. And that would be one step forward. The question about how much money should you be pouring into the interior poor areas and how much should you pour into the areas where people actually live to get higher rates of return, again, is a political sensitive question. Equity always said, well, the poor areas are, the people are very poor, we need to build more roads. But the fact of the matter is, you really probably should basically only be pouring in education, health, so that these people in poor areas can actually move to where the jobs are. You really can't just expect them to stay in these poor areas. Now, that's the big difference between China and South Korea's policies. South Korea essentially went from 20% to almost 90% urban in 30 years. In South Korea, 80% of the population moved out of rural areas into urban areas. And that's why South Korea has been relatively so successful in moving to a high income standard. So this is a big political issue in China. Should you allow people to move or not move? And of course, with the state enterprises and private enterprises, there's the question of, do you want to maintain a very strong public state presence in the enterprise sector? And the leadership strongly believes in this. And I think this is also a political issue. So you have what I call political resistance to what I call changing the policies. I think that the pressure is building, and it's coming in a financial way. China's finances are in very bad shape. Government revenues as a share of GDP has been declining steadily. The provinces are essentially going bankrupt. We don't actually see this outside. In the outside world here in Washington, you see articles talking about financial crisis or the banks or the debt level is too high. That's not actually the problem in China. The problem in China is the fiscal crisis, that the provinces cannot raise enough revenues because they don't have taxing powers. Most of the money goes to the central government, but the responsibilities lie with the local provinces. So the local provinces over the last 10 or 15 years, the only way that they were able to actually get more money was through property development. And that's why you have this issue in China of overly building property, because local governments, that was the only way they could make money. But that doesn't work anymore because there's no longer a demand for that property because people are no longer moving to the cities. So local governments have facing what I would call a fiscal crisis. And the question for the government is, if they really want to stimulate the economy, they can't just sort of like tell the local provinces to spend more because local provinces don't have any money. So you're having a financial fiscal kind of a problem showing up. And at some point, the government has to say to itself, How can I continue to grow? I can't pump prime the economy. Should I start to do something different? And this is going to take time, but China tends to react to these politically sensitive reforms more slowly than one would expect. It's like the one-child policy. The one-child policy was clearly seen as ineffective and didn't make any sense. Even so, it took China maybe 5 to 6 years longer than one would expect to get rid of it. And the same thing is true for hukou. It doesn't make sense to say to people that you cannot move, you have to live where you are. And aside from North Korea and Vietnam, actually, there is no other country in this world that has the so-called residency policy like China has. It's being debated here in Washington constantly. Let's go back to President Trump. When he launched the trade war in 2018, 2019 was based upon tariffs. So most of China's exports to the United States are being tariffed at rates from 15% to 25%. At that time, most analysts, certainly most economists, would say these tariffs don't make sense. They won't reduce the trade deficit. They only raise prices. They'll exacerbate inflation. So today, the evidence is very clear. The trade deficit with China has not declined at all, but we're suffering from inflationary pressures. So practically all what I call commercial business community observers, many foreign policy experts are saying that Trump's tariff policy should be basically gotten rid of. So when Biden came into power, he said he would look at this, but he hasn't changed it at all. And he's basically shown no intention of getting rid of the tariffs. And the reason is there's an argument that these tariffs can be used as leverage to get China to change its policies. The question, however, is what do you want China to do? And the major issue then becomes, well, if we're worried about China's innovative policies, technological policies, concerned that it's a rising technological power, and this is a threat to the United States. So the US policies under Biden has basically been to decouple, to restrict China's access to technology, cut off financial, professional, other exchanges. And there is a separation between the two economies. So when I wrote about this a couple of years ago, my major point was that tariffs didn't make any sense. It first hurts Americans, consumers who have to pay more. American companies have to pay more for inputs, therefore they're not as competitive. So here we are 4 or 5 years later. What do we see? We see that America's manufacturing exports hasn't increased at all. America's dependence upon imported manufactured goods continues to increase significantly. So if the goal of the tariffs was to improve the productivity or competitiveness of American companies, it hasn't done so at all. What about households? They're paying more, they have inflation. So to me, the tariffs don't make any sense. What about the restrictions of exports of high-tech products to China? And this is largely being done on competition or security grounds. And this is hurting. There's no doubt that China is going to be hurt by these kinds of restrictions. There are estimates which say that China's growth rate over the next 3, 4, 5 years might be lowered by, let's say, 1 percentage point because of these restrictions. But there isn't much focus on the fact that in the medium term, longer term, America's growth rate will actually fall by 1 percentage point. Now, why is that? For 2 reasons. US companies depend upon research and development to remain technologically advanced. Most of these companies export a lot to China. When they're being told that they can't, their profits will be reduced. So there are estimates that US high-tech companies, their profits will decline by anywhere from about 20 to 30, 40% in the medium term. And therefore, America's innovative capacity will be damaged. So there's been simulations which show that in the medium, longer term, America is actually hurt more than China. Now, we're beginning to actually see this actually. We're seeing that the productivity of US companies are actually starting to decline, okay? And that's why they're no longer as competitive globally as they used to be. So my basic point was that if you continue the restrictive policies, which began under Trump. Both sides suffer, but we have to also remember that America suffers. So suppose China's growth rate falls by 1 percentage point because of these kinds of decoupling measures. China, let's say 4 or 5 years down the line, may not be able to grow at 5 or 6%. It grows at 1% less, 4 to 5. But in America, that typically grows at 2%, would grow at only 1%. And in America, which grows only at 1% a year, would experience tremendous problems. Now, the IMF just came up with a study about a month ago showing that these restrictive tariffs and trade measures will lead to a decline in global output for everybody in the range of 7 to 12%. So when we think about these kinds of tensions between the United States and China and all these restrictive measures that are actually being debated in Washington today, we tend to think about it as punishing or hurting China or containing China or slowing down its progress. We don't actually realize that it has a very significant effect globally in a negative way. It also has a significant negative effect on the United States. Peterson Institute did a study just about a month ago. It showed that these tariffs and restrictive policies reduced America's exports to China by about 20%. Okay? And that was a major source of growth for American manufacturers, which no longer is available. So we tend to think about the harm done to China, but we don't actually realize that there's actually a lot of harm being done to the United States. So both sides basically suffer under a trade war. Let me make one further point. When I talked about Biden's policy toward China, I was also trying to differentiate a China from a Russia. Right now, Biden's view is that tensions with China reflects the battle between autocracies and democracies. And both Russia and China grouped together as autocracies, and in some ways being treated similarly. As an economic viewpoint, Russia and China are quite different. Russia has always behaved in terms of foreign policy with the view that they could do anything it wanted with impunity because Europe and others needed its energy resources. So that's why it intervened in the Middle East. That's why it invaded Ukraine. It did not think the West would punish it. And of course, the West is trying to punish it. But even with the sanctions, Russia still continued to behave what I call irresponsibly. Now, China is different from Russia. China depends upon a well-functioning global economy to survive, to prosper. It's the largest trading nation with 110 countries. It wants a rules-based international economic system. It wants more foreign investment. It wants actual cordial relations with the world and particularly with the West. Russia has never basically advocated or needed that. So Russia and China are quite different economically. This has a foreign policy political implication. So in my article, I said, US policy should be designed to try to sort of like separate Russia and China. And that would actually make it much easier for the United States to further its global interest in creating what I call a liberal economic system or a liberal political system. But instead, of course, by containing China, by establishing or strengthening defense treaties in Asia, we're more or less forcing China to become much closer to Russia. And I would basically say that's not in America's interest in the long term. Let me start off with the US position. The US position today is seeing a decoupling, a separation of the two economies. Well, the first thing you realize here, the largest and the second largest economy, they have very strong trade and financial relations. It's not possible to decouple them. So no matter what we do here to restrict our economic relations with China, there will continue to be significant trade and financial flows going from the United States to China. And it will probably continue even in a technology transfer sense. The US-China research collaboration is the largest in the world, larger than, for instance, US-England or US-Germany or US-Japan. The number of jointly co-authored articles between Chinese and American scholars are multiples more than it is with any other country. And we forget that link. If we weaken that link, we're also going to lower what I call the innovative capacity of the United States. So I think this is a major issue. Now, the question then will be for what I would say the Washington foreign policy community, what do you actually want to do in terms of containing China? Do you want, for example, China to no longer be able to innovate, to grow and prosper? And if that's the case, the whole world is affected. I mean, we forget that if you go back to the last 20, 30 years, global GDP growth increased by about 30 to 40% more than it did before, just from the rise of China. So everybody's income increased, okay? Now when we try to contain China, we're basically saying we want to go back to the pattern before that, where global growth was in fact much lower. Emerging market economies will take a big hit. And I just don't think this is realistic. Now, most of these so-called high-tech products being restricted, they have what I call a very small security concern in terms of military applications. But the use of these products for commercial general purposes, vastly larger. So when we restrict China's ability to import these components, we're going to be restricting the global world's access to what I call lower priced products. And it's not clear to me this makes much sense. If you argue that a semiconductor has a security implication, you make the same argument. What about iron and steel? Iron and steel can be used to make tanks and missiles, but they can also be used to make cars and fences. Okay. How do we actually separate a so-called military use of something from a commercial use? And I think it's almost impossible, actually. Over the past year, some commentators have said that if China's growth rate stagnates, let's say at 2 or 3% a year, and is unable to stay at 5 or 6%, then China may never catch up with the United States in terms of its overall GDP. But if China grows, let's say at 5%, 6% a year for the foreseeable 10 years, then its economy will be larger than America's probably about 10 or 15 years from now. But the point I would actually make is that something that America should worry about? And the answer is actually not. It's not the size of your economy that gives you an indication of your so-called global power, the great power. It's your per capita income. So per capita income in the United States is about $60,000, $70,000. China's per capita income is around 12. So America's per capita income is 5 to 6 times that of China. So why is per capita income a better proxy for power? Because we know that innovation, the ability to innovate, your ability to be technologically sophisticated is largely determined by your per capita GDP, not by your size of your economy. So America's stayed at the very top in terms of being the most innovative power for decades. China used to be something like 40 to 50 rank. It's now moved up to about 20. The gap is closing, but America's status as the dominant innovative power has remained and will continue to remain for the foreseeable future. So whether or not China grows, let's say 5, 6%, and its economy becomes bigger in an overall sense, is not actually the concern if you're really interested in questions like power. America's dominance, military-wise, security-wise, technologically, will remain for the foreseeable future, regardless of whether or not the gap is actually getting a bit smaller. This is a very important issue, and it reflects the fact that what you see about security and foreign policy concerns depends on where you sit. If you're in the US, you see China as a potential threat. You see it as being more aggressive in the South China Sea. You see it as not being very helpful in dealing with Ukraine by not criticizing Russia. If you're sitting in Beijing and looking outside, what you see is America establishing military defense alliances with Australia, Japan, UK, the submarine deal, other kinds of strengthening bases in the Philippines and elsewhere. You see the creation of what I call a potential new NATO for Asia, designed to contain China, similar to what I call the NATO forces in Europe. So whether we can be critical of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and I am actually bothered by that, nevertheless, there is this issue. From a Russian perspective, they see NATO basically pushing on Russia's ability to influence the region. Same thing is happening in China. And I don't think that's a healthy. There should be actually a deliberate policy initiative, not to contain China, but to basically say, how do I get China to behave in ways which would be better for the United States, rather than saying, how do I continue to sort of like push or repress them? That's a big issue. Let's take climate change. Can the United States reasonably say that China should collaborate on climate change at the same time that America's policies toward China are so aggressive or so repressive? Well, let's look at climate change. How do you get what I call a collaborative, good relationship to address climate change between the United States and China? And the answer is it depends upon two issues. Trust. You cannot succeed in climate change unless both sides trust each other in terms of addressing. And of course, trust is being destroyed. The second is technology. We cannot solve the climate change issues without better technology, whether it's in solar or wind power, carbon capture, new materials, better batteries. And we can only do this through collaboration between Western and Chinese technology. So if you bar the transfer of technology between the United States and China, how can you expect collaboration on technologies for green growth to succeed? So for me, it's a hopeless issue to try to promote global climate change policies at the same time as you're sort of like having these tensions between the United States and China. Well, China's been trying to internationalize the RMB or to increase its use for more than a decade. And it's driven by the observation that America's greatest foreign policy weapon is the dollar. Being able to sanction a country and prevent its access to the US dollar-denominated system is a major blow economically. And increasingly over the last 10 years, America has applied that dollar sanction to many countries, whether it's Russia, North Korea, Cuba, Iran, Iraq, whatever. So China is very worried that in some kind of conflict, it will be subject to a so-called sanction in terms of China's access to the dollar as a global currency. So it's been basically trying to increase its use. Trade with Russia, for example, China's trying to basically denominate that trade in RMB, and it's trying to do that with other countries in East Asia. The question is this feasible or likely? The answer is not really. It is actually technically not possible for the RMB to be a global currency, as much as you might try. Now, why is that technically not possible? Because lots of people are sitting there measuring it and trying to see whether it's being used more for trade or comparing it with other currencies. And the answer is, what is a global currency? How did the dollar become a global currency? Well, a global currency means that it is accessible outside of the country. It's available globally. So the dollar is available globally everywhere. Now, how do you make it available globally? Well, you can give it away. So if you go back 50, 75 years, you have the Marshall Plan, US aid programs. America gave the dollar away in terms of foreign aid, largely through grants. So you give it away, it doesn't have to be repaid. Now, the second way that America makes the dollar available globally is that America runs trade deficits. So America has been running a trade deficit every year for 50 years. And what happens? When you run a trade deficit, you pay creditors in dollars. So every year, more and more dollars are being pushed to the outside world. Now let's go to China. Its aid program Belt and Road Initiative is not a grant program. It's a loan program. You're supposed to repay it. Secondly, China does not run trade deficits. It runs trade surpluses. So it cannot actually push the RMB because it doesn't have to. People have to give it money. It doesn't have to give them money. So I often point out to people, no matter how much China tries, it cannot make available enough RMB for it to be used as a global currency because there's no physical way, there's no practical way to get the RMB out there. Now, there's a third possibility. The third possibility is that you open up your local financial markets, bond markets and other markets, so that people can freely buy RMB or exchange currencies with their currencies, and they get RMB. But the reality is, why would they do this? There would be risk in terms of putting their money into the Chinese market. You don't know how interest rates and things would move. So that's not likely to occur. So technically speaking, the RMB cannot be a global currency. So that's why China's thinking about digital currencies. But I don't think that's going to basically solve the problem. So the answer is that there is no foreseeable alternative to the use of the dollar, frankly, within our lifetime. Well, the Belt and Road program has changed a lot, and it will change a lot in the coming years. I thought the concept in some ways was very sensible, that if you improve the links between countries, communication links, road links, seaways, railways, road links, you would foster more growth. Everyone would benefit from that. And China, of course, wanted to basically build a bridge to Europe. It has very strong links with the US across the Pacific. What it did not have was good links with Europe, Central Asia, South Asia, and that was the Belt and Road Initiative. The trouble with the Belt and Road Initiative, however, was that the discussion of the loans, the nature of the projects were largely determined by state companies in discussions with recipient countries. So your projects were only as good as the recipient country put an effort into designing such projects, and some did and some did not. But China's view has always been, was guided under the principle, I'm not going to tell the country what they should do. I'll respond to what they want. So if a country wanted a what I call bad project, China's view was, well, that's your issue. I'm not going to tell you whether it's bad or good. If that's what you want, you have to repay the loan, but that's your choice. Okay. Whereas a Western view would be, tell me what you want. If I don't think the project is viable, it doesn't make any sense, I won't finance it. Okay. So that's the difference between a Chinese. Now, China's learned its lesson because some of these projects are not very good. And when they're not very good, it's not just doesn't just reflect badly upon the country, it also reflects badly upon China. So you have all these accusations about debt, poor design. So the Belt and Road project has been scaled back considerably. Some countries have gone into financial debt, not because of the Belt and Road projects, but actually because of the borrowings from others, including the World Bank or ADB and others. And Chinese loans are part of that. So what you now see is a lot of what I call distress loans from China to these countries to help them recover. And there was an article the other day about the fact that China is doing more distress loans than the International Monetary Fund, which is kind of an interesting point. But the future is going to be different. And the future is China is basically taking the view that these projects have to be more financially viable. It's going to be much more careful who it lends to. And China doesn't have as much money as it did have before. So it's going to be scaled down. And it's going to be much more focused, not so much on the money, but on the standards, communication standards, power standards, the movement of products across these borders. And that's actually the issue for the future. The standards that basically countries have when they move products across borders. This is the prediction of many that there'll be two trading blocks, one led by the West and one led by China. And when I look at this particular concept, I say to myself, I don't see how this is possible. And I don't see how it's possible because of the nature of the economies involved. Let's look at United States, let's look at Europe, let's look at China, and let's ask, what are they actually exporting and producing? The United States is essentially producing agricultural commodities, high-value, high-tech products, high-value services. That's its strength, and that's what it exports. And energy now, okay? Europe basically produces high-value consumer goods. So if you go to a shopping center, whether it's in the United States or in China, all the stores are European. If you look at our appliances, all the best appliances are all European. As for cars, all the high-grade cars are European, okay? And then you go to China. What does China specialize in? Well, it doesn't have energy products. It doesn't have the high-value goods. It produces the intermediate goods and raw materials and basic consumer goods. So what you have actually are three major economic centers producing different kinds of commodities, and that's why we have global trade. So what we're trying to do actually is to say, we won't foster trade with China. We will try to encourage the West to trade only about itself. But you have a problem, because Europe cannot succeed without the raw materials and intermediate components from China. Germany, for example, gets 40 to 50% of its exports from producing them in China. Okay, so if you go to China, you see all these European factories producing for the global market. You don't see American companies, you see European companies. So Europe has what I call a much larger economic presence in China than American companies do. Now, what is the American presence in China? Largely through franchises, KFCs, McDonald's, the hotel chains, financial services, but they're not manufacturing, except for Apple. But Apple does not actually manufacture in China, because all the plants, Apple plants in China, are actually Taiwanese companies. So Apple has actually no foreign investment in China. So there's practically no American manufacturing presence in China. Okay? So suppose you decide to cut off America and China, you have a funny situation. It's almost impossible, because all the manufacturing presence of the products that Americans need are in China. It is therefore technically not possible. Okay. Now, the interesting thing is what has happened during this trade war and during all these restrictions in terms of trade patterns. So if you look at America and you ask what's happening in terms of American exports in the last 5 years, the first thing you notice is America's exports to manufacturing hasn't increased at all. It's actually become more dependent on manufacturers by importing more. So what has America been increasing its exports of? The answer is energy. And that's the only product. Crude oil, natural gas, liquefied, boom, boom, boom. That's the major product. Let's look at China. China has been exporting about the same amount to the US as it did 5 years ago because of the trade war. It hasn't increased. But China's exports to the rest of the world have soared. So China's share of global exports has reached record levels, even though that increase hasn't been going to the US. So where has it been going to? The answer has been going to Europe, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. So let me pick two countries as examples, Mexico and Vietnam. 70% of the increase in manufactured goods to America over the last 3 or 4 years have been coming from these two countries. Not so much from China because of the tariffs. So America doesn't import as much from China as it might have because of tariffs, but it's importing the total same amount now from Mexico and Vietnam. So let's look at Mexico and Vietnam. 75% of the components for those manufactured products coming from Vietnam and Mexico come from China. Okay? So the interesting thing is that China is no longer exporting directly to the United States, these manufactured goods. It's indirectly exporting to the United States via Mexico and Vietnam. So why Mexico and why Vietnam? Well, Mexico is obvious because of the trade agreement. It's right next door. Vietnam is obvious because it shares the same border with China, and it has an ASEAN-China trade agreement. So the interesting thing is, At the same time that China's exports have reached record global levels, its imports as a share of its GDP have reached record low levels. So the US is becoming more globally dependent upon the world for imports, but China is becoming less dependent on the world for imports. So the trade war has done what I call has a very paradoxical result. It's actually increased America's dependence on the world, but reduced China's dependence on the world, which is exactly the opposite of the intention. So a lot of what I'm saying in terms of these policies, we should re-examine because they cause a lot of problems, costs, but they don't actually accomplish the purpose that the Washington policy makers had in mind when they put them into place. I think essentially the issue from a Washington perspective is that you want China to behave as a responsible global stakeholder. Okay, rapidly growing economies anywhere is it basically better for everybody? If China grows at 5 to 6% a year this year, and the West grows at 1%, China will account for 40% of the world's demand for goods and services. That'll keep the world growing better. So it's in everyone's interest for China to be doing better. But you want it to do better within a framework that says China behaves responsibly. What does that mean? It means that China is careful about the fact that its exports and imports don't create waves and shocks globally that are not manageable, and it has done that in the past. It means that you want to make sure that if China subsidizes production, that this subsidy does not distort the trade patterns or create unfair advantages. It means that if China uses foreign technology, you want it to use foreign technology on fair and legal grounds, because that basically generates more earnings for US companies. And you want to make sure that both sides benefit. So you therefore need to have what I call institutions which would regulate that trade and technology to better than it has before. So the issue would be, can you get China to basically agree to talk about these issues in a constructive way? And as I talked about earlier, China is interested because it realizes its economic survival or prosperity depends upon a rules-based system. And the problem from my view of the problem is we in the US are moving away from a rule-based system. We're no longer saying that we will rely upon WTO. We won't accept the rulings of these international agencies. We won't subject technology and the use of technology and how it should be regulated to be discussed at a global level. And I think this is the big issue, that it is in the interest of both the West and China to think about the ground rules where these kinds of concerns, which have security implications, can actually be discussed, regulated, inspected if necessary. If we don't, then everyone's going to be worse off. Thank you.
Part of an integrated world, developed countries are responsible for a much larger share. Their prospects have been declining steadily over the past year. They've been hit by inflation in many countries. Europe has suffered a lot from the fact that the war in Ukraine has cut off energy supplies, raised commodities. Trade has become more difficult. Investment levels have stagnated. Japan has not been able to get out of its doldrums. The U.S. is doing better than the others, but even most market observers predict that the American economy is going to slow down, and inflation is still a big issue. If you survey the American public, they actually say that they think the economy is actually not doing very well. And this is causing a big problem for President Biden, because he thinks that unemployment is coming down, GDP growth rates on paper seem very strong, but inflation is persistent. And in the minds of many people, that is a big issue. Everybody in the West is running into what I call fiscal problems. America has a huge budget deficits, pressure to cut back. This is not going to be helpful in terms of expanding growth. Trade volumes are slowing down. Supply chains have been disrupted. Many of the European economies depend upon smooth functioning trade patterns. And now they've not been able to export to Russia. They had to go around to get to the Pacific. Energy prices are becoming erratic and volatile. Commodity prices are going up and down. Unemployment is becoming a persistent issue. A lot of migration, legal or illegal, is causing a lot of pressures on governments. Now The IMF forecast suggests that growth next year will be declining, and this is affecting everyone. But I should also mention that some of this negative impact is also affecting poor countries too. The poorer the countries are, in fact, they've been even hit worse off. The richer countries have a little bit more resources to deal with it, but they have not been unaffected. In the sense that, as you say, it's still significantly better than it was last year. But last year was a low base. The big issue is the future, and that's the same is true with the U.S. The same is true in China. There are many people in the U.S. worry about a potential recession still. They still worry about inflationary pressures. In China, the question is growth going to return to something like a sustainable 4 to 5%? If China could grow at 4 to 5% on a sustainable financial basis for the next 5 to 10 years, that would be great. This is an upper middle income country, likely to become a rich country within the next decade. 5% growth regularly without strong stimulus is very successful. Didn't have the same problem that China had in terms of the post-COVID recovery. Europe, and particularly the United States, focused on fiscal expansion, budgetary support, social welfare systems to maintain very high consumption levels. In fact, they probably overdid it. And that's why you see very strong inflation in the United States in particular and somewhat in Europe. The budgetary support, feeding income transfers to the general population, led to a huge surge in consumption. China did not feed a lot of support to the general population. China was somewhat fortunate, actually. It was able during the pandemic and COVID period to boost up exports to manufactured goods. And there was a huge demand for this in the West. They didn't, in some ways, have to actually support general employment levels through fiscal expansion. But nevertheless, there is what I call a need or concern about whether or not the general population in China not getting this budgetary support, their consumption levels have not surged as much as it has in the West. So you have a funny kind of a situation. Yes, consumption surged, but you also have these inflationary pressures and questions of whether this is financially sustainable. There's tremendous pressure in the US, for example, to cut the budget. You don't have this kind of surge in consumption here, but there's also concern about what will drive growth in China in the future. Because the trouble with the trade patterns is that such a sudden change. If you look at the inflow of electric vehicles coming from China to Europe, the rise is very, very large, very, very quickly. Right. It's hard for the European market to digest it. The same thing was true with solar panels, wind turbine engines 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. All of a sudden, China became very efficient, and markets were in the West, and the surge was very, very quick. So this it's what's called the speed of the change that was really a problem. It has to be so kind of moderated a bit. So I think there should be more of a discussion between EU and China about the inflow of electric vehicles and the batteries. But Europe needs these batteries. America needs these batteries. America is restricting it a lot. They won't allow Chinese battery makers to establish plants. They're reluctant to let any Chinese electric vehicles come in. Yeah.
Well, that's like stopping the future from coming.
Absolutely. You lose the technology and prices rise. And then you have this inflationary pressure in the United States because of this. Prices in the United States have increased by, let's say, 40 to 50% during the pandemic years. Yeah. And you're talking about whether it's clothing, food, cars, services, all across the board. And that's why the polls in the United States of the general public, they basically complain about the economy. And this is surprising to the Democratic Party because from their perception, they thought that all this kind of investment, this expansion, this consumer protection, people would actually, and in fact, unemployment rates fallen a lot, that the general public would be quite happy, but they're not. So this is actually worse. Europe concern about a major trade deficit with China is, in my view, a temporary concern. Prior to this last year and possibly next year, the EU's been running a trade surplus. It's been running a trade surplus for 10 to 15 years, contrary to the US, which runs deficits. So Europe may run a trade deficit with China, but it runs a huge trade surplus with the rest of the world. And that means its overall balance has been in surplus. So its trade deficit issue with China was relatively small and insignificant, didn't matter too much because overall Europe was in the surplus. But this Ukraine war, higher energy prices, that has made a huge difference.
And China's electric vehicles.
And electrical vehicles have surged. So all this has come together at the same time. I don't think you will see a huge deficit European trade deficit with China next year. This is a temporary issue. It's relied upon manufacturing and services to drive its economy. It's hit by the fact that it was getting commodities and energy relatively cheaply from Russia, no longer can do so. It has to pay higher energy prices into the future. The second thing is it's finding that it's falling behind both China and the US in terms of innovation and technology, whether there's the green technologies or the digital activities.
Is it because over-regulation, bureaucracy, lack of efficiency?
They have not been able to coordinate their efforts. If you want to be truly innovative these days, it's a lot easier if you do it on a big scale. Okay, Europe together is big, but individually it is small. They've not been able to coordinate what I call the promotion of technology innovation as a European issue. It's a specific country, and each country is relatively small. It's unlike the United States.
Yeah.
The United States is going very heavily in trying to promote artificial intelligence, pharmaceuticals. You don't see these leaders in Europe.
Yeah.
Now, Germany was always seen as a high-quality manufacturing economy.
Right.
But if you think about it very carefully, they're not seeing it as an innovative economy. They're seeing it as precise, precision, high quality. Europe has been seen, for example, as fashion, as art, everything else. But technology, that was never its strength. In the new world, this is a big concern. And they feel like they're falling behind, not just the United States, but they feel like they're even falling behind China, which is rising very quickly. And you're right. It's been 4 years since I've been able to come back to China. I went to Shanghai. I spent a lot of time. I spent a lot of time with Chinese businesses. Here, I spent a lot of time with Chinese policymakers. That dynamism, that spirit and energy still exists here in China. China's greatest strength is its competitive. Firms are very competitive. They're searching for constantly new ideas. So I have a lot of confidence, in fact, that China will continue to grow fairly rapidly. But there is a temporary problem, the property bubble. And the property bubble is going to be serious because it accounts for a large share of growth. The fact that OECD and Europe, United States, growth will slow down creates a problem for China because they may not buy as many Chinese products. So China faces a concern that it may not be able to export as much. So the property market is a problem. Exports may not be as dynamic. So then the big issue is, how can China drive growth? And the answer is there's still a lot of things that China can do. But they're sensitive. Some of these issues are sensitive. I'll give you a very simple issue. Where is the demand going to come from in China if you're not going to come from a property? And it's not going to come from trade. It's going to have to come from consumption or domestic investment. People talk a lot about hukou reform in China.
Who?
Hukou reform. Migrant workers do not have full residency rights in major cities. So major cities in China, about 40% of the population don't have hukou, but they don't right to local services. So people talk about this as a social issue, but it's a major economic issue because migrant workers, they save at a rate of 40% higher than normal Chinese. If they had full residency rights, for example, and they consumed like other Chinese households, consumption in China would increase by 30%. That would increase China's growth rate by a full percentage point, just by itself, and had no cost. So there are lots of these kinds of things that China can do in the future, and that could maintain adequate demand. So I'm pretty confident that the government is starting to look at these issues, and that China therefore could grow at a rate of 5% on a sustainable fashion for the future.